The book of Genesis, the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, was written, researchers think, across about a 500-year period between 10th and 5th century BCE. It tells the story of the creation of humanity. From that humanity emerges a distinct chosen people, known now collectively as Jews. It was a people in Genesis who were promised a land promised by a single creator God, the creator of earth. When the Hebrew Bible was written, its writers were living in that land, but they lived in a competitive area, leading to a stressed existence in that area. They were pushed by the Assyrians from the northern kingdom of Israel down to the southern kingdom of Judah. Jews were then exiled by the Babylonians, allowed to return under the Persians, ruled under the Hellenes, then under the Romans. Then, after revolting against the Romans, were pushed, more or less, out of the region entirely. A stressed existence would continue to categorize the Jewish people going forward. They spread across the earth, held together by a common text, the Hebrew Bible, but living apart, living as minorities everywhere. Typically receiving protection in Christian and Muslim societies, on one hand, but also historically enduring persecution from those same societies on the other. By the 18th and 19th century, most Jews lived in Europe. The philosophy of the time, then, gave them a historic chance, a chance to stop thinking of themselves primarily as Jews, and to assimilate into the nations forming around them, into the nations in which they lived. It was a controversial opportunity that many, Jewish and non-Jewish, rejected. Towards the end of the 19th century, popular resentment and popular action against Jews grew and grew, causing some to give up. They renounced assimilation and decided to go their own way, forming a movement calling for Jews of the world to band together as their own nation, to live on a territory where they could govern themselves as Jews. The movement was given a name, Zionism. The territory they chose was their biblical home, the land that was then called Palestine. Palestine, though, was inhabited. What Zionism meant exactly for the inhabitants of Palestine at the time was an open question, but it clearly spelled a problem in the least for even the remotely politically aware. Within that, the groundwork was set, on one hand, for a struggle for Jews, the ones who wanted to escape persecution and form their own nation, their own state, their own homeland. And on the other, a conflict over the homeland they chose, Palestine. Where we left off last time, a man, Theodor Herzl, had been shocked by anti-Semitism in Europe. He believed that the Jewish question wasn't going away. It was worsening. It had awakened a sense of Jewish nationalism in him, which made him believe that as a matter of national pride, and even for questions of safety, Jews needed their own state. But it was an idea in its infancy. He believed that a mass movement needed to sweep that state into being, and that a leader, him, needed to head it. He began by publishing a short book to popularize his ideas, called The Jewish State. We're going to trace now how that went from being an idea in Herzl's pamphlet to becoming a reality with the State of Israel in 1948. And we're going to start by putting ourselves in Theodor Herzl's shoes. Herzl, in 1896, had articulated his dream, but had a number of technical factors preventing him from realizing it. For one, even the Jews of the world, at the time, were overwhelmingly against him. For most Jews still, the anti-Semitism in Europe was not enough to shake their commitment to assimilation. Zionism was widely even seen as a threat to them. If Jews were a nation with a land somewhere else, it seemed to undermine the relation that many Jews felt with the nation in which they lived. Zionism was even thought of as a tool for anti-Semites, who could now point out that Jews, by their own admission, were not one of them. They were strangers in the midst of other nations. The novelist Stefan Zweig summed up the Jewish reaction around him in Vienna to Herzl by saying, "What has happened to this otherwise intelligent, witty, and cultivated writer? Why should we go to Palestine? Our language is German, not Hebrew, and beautiful Austria is our homeland." For traditionalists, Zionism was essentially heresy, as they still believed that a Messiah needed to guide their return to the homeland. But still, Herzl benefited from being relatively known in the Jewish world, both as a journalist and a playwright. His turn to Zionism was seen as surprising, but to some it was inspiring. His book was widely circulated, and a following formed around him. His next major step was to hold an event that would announce Zionism to the world, an event that would imbue it with respect, cohesion, and legitimacy. It was the first Zionist Congress, where Zionists from around the world met and debated. In that Congress, choosing their words carefully, they made the goal of Zionism official. It read, "The aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law." It's worth pointing out that they just say a home in Palestine and not a state. It was ambiguous wording that they thought made their goal sound less ambitious and more reasonable. It was a conscious strategy of publicly downplaying their goal, a theme in Zionism from the start, and a continuous theme going forward. Herzl soon noted that his heart was behaving erratically. His heart was, in fact, failing him. He spent the rest of his life almost singularly focused on trying to bring a Jewish state into being. Another technical problem he had to deal with was a lack of funds. He petitioned wealthy Jewish patrons around the world, but was disappointed by their support. Baron Edmund de Rothschild had funded the discreet colonization of Palestine up until that point. But he saw Herzl's overt politics as a threat, and when Herzl approached him for funding, they fought. "You are the keystone of the entire combination," Herzl told him. "If you refuse, everything I have fashioned so far will fall to pieces. I shall then be obliged to do it in a different way. I shall start a mass agitation." Herzl then did look for funds in his own way. As he put it to a supporter, after all the Jews combined have more money than the Rothschilds. He then gave Zionism steady revenue by creating the World Zionist Organization and charging its members a shekel. Combined with Herzl investing his own money, it was enough for Zionism under Herzl to get by during the early years, allowing them, for example, to repeatedly meet and decide on things, like what they thought a flag for a future Jewish state should look like, a flag that ended up being rather close to the one that Israel actually chose. There was then easily the biggest problem of all, the problem of bringing a Jewish state into being in a modern, international, and bureaucratic world. A state no less that quite clearly conflicted with the wishes of the overwhelming majority of people living there. Herzl disapproved of the style of colonization that was happening in Palestine, a style he called infiltration. He believed that the best path forward was a slightly more straightforward one, where Zionists would deal directly with official authorities, which essentially meant shifting their focus to lobbying. They would work to gain the support of the highest, most powerful authorities possible. The goal was to get official sanction to build a Jewish state. If they could officially build their own state, then they could set their own immigration policies in regard to Jews in the diaspora. It also meant that anything they built would be permanent and legally respected. It is stupid, as Herzl put it, to build a house without getting title to the building plot. The support he needed most, the support that would more or less solve his problem, was that of the Ottoman Sultan, the man who legally controlled Palestine. But that support would not be forthcoming. The Ottoman Empire was deeply in debt. As the Ottomans were weakening across the 19th century, European states vied for power in the region. The French took control of much of Ottoman Northwest Africa, while the British took Egypt from the Ottomans, giving them control of the Suez Canal. Herzl saw the Ottomans' weakness and debt problem as a potential political opening, and approached the Sultan, apparently, at least to some extent, bluffing, offering to use Rothschild wealth to solve the Ottomans' debt problem in exchange for territorial concessions for Jews in Palestine. But the Sultan was closed to negotiating. He responded, "The Turkish Empire belongs not to me, but to the Turkish people. I cannot give away any part of it. Let the Jews save their billions. When my empire is partitioned, they may get Palestine for nothing. Our corpse will be divided." Herzl tried the Germans, petitioning the Kaiser, who met with Herzl and expressed interest in developing a protectorate for Jews in Palestine. But the Kaiser ultimately drew closer to the Sultan, pulling him away from Zionists' interests. Herzl petitioned the Russian government, hoping to find a mutual interest in that both parties wanted to move Jews out of Russia. And in response, they acknowledged that Jews were living bad lives in Russia, but were unwilling to do anything deviating from their existing policies. The United States was still an isolated country, so in terms of major powers, Zionists were left with Britain and France. Of the two, the British seemed to show greater interest. They were seen to have greater regional interests, as having a friendly power in Palestine would give them a buffer to the Suez Canal, which in turn gave them a pathway by water to their treasured colony of India. The British also culturally seemed to empathize with Zionists. But crucially for the Zionists, neither Britain or France were willing to make a strong move that would alienate the Ottomans, or Turkey, as they were still a potential powerful geopolitical ally in the region. The diplomatic breakthrough that Herzl was looking for in his lifetime never happened. He died in 1904. But still, his actions brought Zionism greater cohesion, greater visibility, organization, greater public legitimacy. It was becoming something that people, Jewish or non-Jewish, had to take notice of. The great powers of the world were granting Zionists audience. They were paying them the honor of granting their interests attention. One of those powers had even made an offer. In 1903, Britain had offered Zionists unrestricted immigration to a territory they controlled, what they called Uganda. It was land east of Lake Victoria, so in our contemporary terms, they were actually talking about Kenya. Herzl urged Zionists to consider it, even as a temporary solution for Jews who needed it most, by which he then mostly meant Russian Jews, who by then had suffered yet another pogrom in 1903. But Russian Jews were an especially religious bloc, and were especially devoted to Palestine and only Palestine. So they ironically formed the largest bloc against Herzl, and even called him a traitor against Zionism. And the Uganda idea, as they called it, was scrapped shortly after Herzl's death. Zionism then went through a relatively quiet, leaderless period. In Palestine, immigration continued, but on a relatively small scale. By 1909, the first all-Jewish city was founded, Tel Aviv. Its name in Hebrew roughly translating to a spring on a hill, marking an ancient site. It symbolized for Jews, in a way, a clean break, a city they could build away from European influence and away from Arab influence. Socialism among Zionists was popular, even dominant. There was little in the way of, you could say, bourgeois resistance there, or built-up power structures. No revolution needed to occur. They could take socialism under the influence of Europe and face relatively little resistance implementing their ideals, most popularly taking shape in the form of a collective farm, a kibbutz. Disputes happened between Arabs and Jews, but usually on a local level, typically over individual plots of land. There was some violence, typically from the native population towards the oncoming settlers. But for the entire history of Zionism up until 1909, almost 3 decades, only around 13 Jews were killed in that way, and only 2 for apparently national reasons. Around that time, after about 3 decades, the first signs of organized resistance began to appear. In 1910, a newspaper owned by Greek Orthodox Arabs published excerpts from Herzl's Jewish State and some resolutions from the Zionist Congress the year after. Its editor wrote a pamphlet explaining the aims of Zionism and warned that its goal was not just immigration, but to take over Palestine. He pleaded to Arabs not to sell land to the colonists. Palestinian nationalism was beginning to take shape, but typically in the broader form of Arab nationalism. For the moment, it was even then a small sentiment, held by so few that academics have literally tried to count them. Perhaps 126 or 180 around that time in the region, making about 3 for every 100,000 people living in Palestine. A well-known Arab nationalist in Jerusalem wrote his analysis of the scene in his diary in 1914. What I despise is this principle which the Zionist movement has set up, which is that it should subjugate another national movement to make itself strong, and that it should kill an entire nation so that it might live. Because this is as if it is trying to steal its independence and take it by deceit, out of hand of destiny. This independence, which is acquired by cash, whereby the opportunity of other nations' lethargy, weakness, and indolence is exploited, is indeed a feeble independence, founded on sand. What will the Jews do if the national feeling of the Arab nation is aroused? How will they be able to stand up to the Arabs? A question we'll return to. That same year, World War I began. As more and more powers were drawn into the conflict, Turkey joined Germany's side. In that decision for Zionists, an opportunity was made. An opportunity that was spotted and capitalized on by a rising Zionist named Chaim Weizmann, a chemist who came from a small town, as he put it, from one of the darkest and remote corners of the Pale of Settlement. In 1915, the British were running low on acetone, a chemical compound needed for explosives. Weizmann had already made a discovery with acetone. When he learned of Britain's problem, he positioned himself to the British as the man who could solve it. He met with Lloyd George, the soon-to-be Prime Minister, but at that time the Minister for Munitions, and claimed that he could devise for the British a method that would let them produce acetone themselves on an industrial scale. "How long can you give me?" Weizmann asked. Lloyd George responded, "I cannot give you very long. It is pressing." Weizmann replied, "I will go at it night and day." Weizmann did successfully industrialize acetone for the British, a method he gave them free of charge. The British asked how they could honor the service in return, and Weizmann replied, "There is nothing I want for myself. I would like you to do something for my people." What that effectively gained for Weizmann and Zionists was not a direct breakthrough, but access. Access to lobby their interests within the highest circles of the British political elite. His sense of a wartime opportunity with the British was correct. Early in his lobbying, with hardly any prodding, a high-ranking official told him what he wanted to hear. Since Turkey had entered the war, he had given the problem much consideration. Realization of the Zionist dream was possible. Big things would have to be done in Palestine. Weizmann then requested a meeting with Arthur Balfour, a former British Prime Minister and member of the Parliament. Weizmann focused on Balfour for a reason. Balfour was a devout Christian who believed that Jews had been historically wronged and that Christians owed Jews an immeasurable debt. Weizmann had previously met him, but now felt that it was time to advance his interests more fully. He explained to him the Zionist position on Jewry in Europe, and Balfour, he recalled, was moved to tears. "He took me by the hand," Weizmann said, and said I had illuminated for him the road followed by a great suffering nation. Herzl and Weizmann had a similar diplomacy-forward take on Zionism, lobbying the great powers of the world to try to get official sanction to build a Jewish state. But they had differences in their approach, and one could begin to understand that by looking at the fact that, while Herzl urged Zionists to keep an open mind and explore the Uganda issue, Weizmann led the opposition against Herzl, holding the stance that Zionists shouldn't even consider it. To pause for a moment and spoil where this is going, the story of Zionism has an arc. It's a story of a group of people moving farther and farther to the right. To say that isn't controversial, it's the common understanding of it. But in all my research, I've never seen anyone say what exactly it means to move to the right. What in Zionist politics is right? So before we go any further, I think I should try to sort this out. You might say right means more nationalistic, but all Zionism is nationalism. Zionism is a nationalist movement. It's just Jewish nationalism that says its home is in Palestine. Others might say, well, okay, left means there's more socialism. That works as a supplemental consideration, but it's not necessary. Again, Zionism is a nationalist movement. All major ideologies can be put on their own left-right spectrums without bringing in others as supplements, and nationalism is no exception. For example, with socialism, farther left means you want flatter hierarchies and more equality. With the farthest left, like communism, it's theoretically perfectly flat, while farther right, like democratic socialism, is more tolerant of hierarchies and inequality relative to other socialists. With liberalism, farther left means you're more in favor of controlling mechanisms, say to stabilize markets, while farther right means you want fewer controlling mechanisms in your society, like a freer market. So what about nationalism then? I've seen academics hint at it, so I'm not entirely making this up, but I've never seen anyone clearly spell it out, and I think for our purposes, I should do it. The only left-right axis that makes sense to me for nationalism is to put universalism on the left and particularism on the right. Universalists try to think broadly. They think of their own needs, but they also think of needs outside of their own nation. They typically emphasize things like international cooperation, building up and protecting weak nations, and peace and solidarity between nations. The United Nations, for example, is a left-wing nationalist idea. It's an organization that sees the world as made up of sovereign nations, but believes those nations should communicate with one another, cooperate, especially to help weaker nations, and peacefully work out their conflicting needs. Woodrow Wilson was an earlier left-wing nationalist thinker, essentially laying the intellectual framework that would eventually lead to the United Nations. Simón Bolívar, with his wars of liberation across the Americas, was another great example, and the French revolutionaries were arguably the first example, as they invented modern nationalism, and then tried in theory to create a Europe of sovereign equal nations, going on what they called a crusade for universal freedom. Particularists, in comparison, are much more concerned with the specific characteristics and the needs of their own nation. Germany provided an early and leading example of particularism, emphasizing their own particular culture, their language, their feelings, and their national needs. So particularists have a more inward view on nationalism. They're more inclined to be interested in other nations insofar as they could benefit them, or be a potential ally or enemy. In extreme cases, they might strive for the supremacy of their own nation, sometimes justified on racial grounds. Germany would continue to be the leading particularist until the middle of the 20th century. Herzl came from a Europe where universalist nationalism was popular, and embodied, in his Zionism, left-wing nationalism. He believed that Jews deserved equal footing with other nations of the world. He believed that Jews needed to act carefully, in a way that would bring them respect and honor in the eyes of the rest of the world. He could be criticized for having a perhaps intentional blind spot towards the effect Zionism would have on the Arabs of Palestine. And there's an often quoted passage in his diary about someday spiriting the penniless population across the border. But for what it's worth, I think the biggest public statement he made was in a fictionalized novel he wrote about a future Jewish state, where an Arab sums up their relationship by saying, "The Jews have brought us wealth and health. Why should we harbor evil thoughts about them? They live among us like brothers. Why should we not return their kindly feelings?" A relationship that's, you could say, perhaps naive, but clearly universalist. By Weizmann's time, nationalist politics were shifting. By the 1930s, the term nationalism became associated almost exclusively with particularist movements, with right-wing principles. Right-wing Zionism got its start from a man named Asher Ginsburg, best known by his pen name, Ahad Ha'am, who developed what became known as cultural Zionism. His main idea was that Zionists needed to emphasize and develop their own particular Jewish character. For Zionism to succeed, he thought, they needed to focus on their Jewishness and go through a Jewish cultural revival. Weizmann was heavily influenced by both Herzl and Ahad Ha'am. His politics were somewhere in between the two, not fully particularist and not fully universalist. But he importantly, for our purposes, took a step away from Herzl, a step politically to the right. It was a direction, a rightward shift in Zionist politics, that would begin under him and will go on to be a more or less continuous theme across the rest of the series. Going back to our story, in the context of Weizmann courting the British to get support for Zionism, it meant he often did it with a particularist view, doing whatever he thought he needed to do to achieve Zionist goals, regardless of external consequences, which sort of inherently brought controversy to his actions. Probably the most extreme example of that was his ongoing effort to prevent a peace deal that would have ended World War I. The balance of power in the First World War was remarkably even, but among the Central Powers, the Ottomans, or Turkey, didn't have anywhere near the unity or the resolve to fight that the Germans did. Many efforts were made by the Allies to form a peace deal with Turkey, which would have upset the balance of power in the war and almost certainly ended it. But in Weizmann's particularist eyes, the peace was a threat to Zionism. The best outcome for Zionists, he thought, would be if Turkey lost the war, and lost the war badly. If that happened, the ownership of Palestine might be opened up, and Zionists might be able to claim it. So as he learned of attempts by the Allies to make a peace deal with Turkey, Weizmann would actively work to undermine them. That doesn't mean that he alone was necessarily responsible for preventing a peace deal from happening. For example, at one point, the British tasked him with blocking an American diplomat, so with him out of the way, they could readily send their own. But it does show a Zionism behaving in a way that I think is hard to imagine under Herzl. We're talking about prolonging a war costing millions of lives for the sake of potential political gains in Palestine. But for better or for worse, for Zionists, there were gains that were realized. In the later years of the war, Lloyd George became prime minister. By then, Weizmann had 3 key allies in the upper echelons of the British government: Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour, and Winston Churchill. Leveraging them, he was able to get the British to issue an official statement of support. Zionists prepared a statement for the British, which they then gave to a high-status Briton, a Rothschild who had converted to Zionism, to give to the British government. The British then, in 1917, issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration. The key passage read, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." We could go quickly into why the declaration was made. For some, it was propaganda. Weizmann had played into a stereotype and had convinced the British government that international Jewry, or world Jewry, was this immense underground power that supported Zionism and would rally behind the British if they made a declaration in favor of it. Which, as far as I'm aware, isn't true on any level, and perhaps needless to say, didn't happen. Others genuinely wanted to help Jews and were convinced that Zionism was the means to do it. Weizmann had also convinced the British, again falsely, that Germany was about to issue their own Zionist declaration, which made the British believe they had to beat Germany to it. Importantly for our purposes, the declaration was made, and once it was made, it was something the British felt they couldn't go back on. Britain, furthermore, was the country that was poised to inherit, and did inherit, custodianship of Palestine in the aftermath of the First World War. Among Zionists, it was celebrated as a major breakthrough, the first major promise of a concrete legal existence in Palestine. Arabs, though, for more than one reason, were outraged. To understand why, we need to rewind a little. Arabs were in the process of forming their own nationalist movements. It was unclear exactly what would come from it. It was held by many that Arabs should form one large nation stretching across the Middle East. The British were interested because it potentially meant yet another source of pressure against the Ottomans. Arabs, in turn, wanted British support to help stage an uprising that would free them from the Ottomans. They initiated contact with the British, and the British, in turn, in a series of messages, gave them a pledge of support. They would help the Arabs overthrow the Ottomans, and afterwards, they would support an Arab kingdom across the Middle East, a kingdom that Arabs believed included Palestine. The author of the messages later insisted that the British never meant to include Palestine, but the reality was that his wording was intentionally vague. "What we have to arrive at now is to tempt the Arab people into the right path," he told a colleague, "detach them from the enemy and bring them on to our side. This, on our part, is at present largely a matter of words, and to succeed, we must use persuasive terms and abstain from academic haggling over conditions." Based on that correspondence, the Arabs went into action, staging a small war against the Ottomans with British support, famously depicted in Lawrence of Arabia. It also meant that they went to war with misconceptions regarding Palestine, misconceptions that the British never corrected. If that wasn't all enough, in the chaos and insecurity of the period, there was yet another development. France and Britain had historically been rivals and had only recently become allies. Trying to ease tensions between one another about their intentions in the Middle East, 2 representatives met, named Sykes from Britain and Picot from France, who drew up a secret agreement, sketching on a map 2 broad spheres of influence for the powers, to be implemented at the war's end. A design that conflicted with promises made, both to Arabs and Zionists. What that all meant in practice was that at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire fell, and the legal status of Palestine became an open question. There were then 3 conflicting ideas about the shape of power in the Middle East, Zionist ideas, Arab nationalist ideas, and ideas arrived at privately between Britain and France. A new map of the Middle East was drawn at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. In it, new polities were created and placed under the supervision of more powerful foreign states in a setup called a mandate. The great powers would supervise these new polities, help them develop, and eventually, theoretically, give them autonomy. Britain was given a mandate over Palestine in 1922. To them, it was perhaps more of a duty than an asset, as it was quickly becoming clear that governing Palestine would require an immense amount of resources. In an attempt to implement the Balfour Declaration, they tried to govern Palestine with balance, giving voice to both Arabs and Jews, while not overtly favoring one or the other. Jews were allowed to establish a national representative body, the Jewish Agency, which could now manage the affairs of Jews in Palestine with British oversight, essentially acting as a provisional government. It was a major achievement for Zionism. Jews had gone from having theoretical power to now having an official voice in Palestine, legitimized by Britain and its mandate. Arabs were offered councils, bodies to advise the British on policy. For the most part, their offers were rejected, though Arabs did create a Supreme Muslim Council, giving Arabs leadership through the lens of religion, headed by a Mufti of Jerusalem. Despite obvious Arab reticence, there was hope among the British that it was an arrangement that would work for everyone. Weizmann and the head of the Arab revolt, Prince Faisal, had exchanged pledges of mutual support. There was an expectation that Arabs and Jews would talk with one another to peacefully work out their differences and perhaps even cooperate. Winston Churchill, visiting Palestine and speaking to a group of Jews in 1922, tried to begin the mandate on an optimistic note, saying, "Every step you take should be for the moral and material benefit of all Palestinians. If you do this, Palestine will be happy and prosperous, and peace and concord will always reign. It will turn into a paradise and will become, as is written in the scriptures you have just presented to me, a land flowing with milk and honey, in which sufferers of all races and religions will find a rest from their sufferance. You, Jews of Palestine, have a very great responsibility. You are the representatives of the Jewish nation all over the world, and your conduct should provide an example for, and do honor to, Jews in all countries. I am now going to plant a tree, and I hope that in its shadow, peace and prosperity may return once more to Palestine." As the tree was handed to Churchill, it broke. There was no spare. Balfour visited Palestine for the first time 3 years later, in 1925. During his trip, he stayed at a hotel in Damascus. Arabs learned where he was, and thousands gathered. Violence broke out between the protesters and law enforcement. Balfour's Arab companion tried to explain to him what was happening, while Balfour looked on, musing that it was extraordinarily interesting. What Balfour was witnessing was the rise of Arab nationalism. The Arab uprising against the Ottomans, what became known as the Great Arab Revolt, served as a foundational story for that nationalism, helping unite and spread it across the Arab world. As it took shape, it took on a particularist character, and in its particularist view, it became highly anti-imperialistic, something helped along by Britain's perceived betrayal during the uprising regarding Palestine, and the removal of an Arab nationalist government in Syria in 1920 by France, as France was given a mandate and essentially implemented Sykes-Picot. As Arab nationalism organized in Palestine, they created their first Congress in 1919, independent of the British, a body that enabled them, like the Zionists, to make official statements. But their nationalist identity, at first, was linked to Syria, which had historically been linked to Palestine. As the first Palestinian Arab Congress put it, "We consider Palestine as part of Arab Syria, as it has never been separated from it at any time. We are connected with it by national, religious, linguistic, natural, economic, and geographical bonds." But when France took over Syria, Arab Palestinians gave up on the idea, focusing their identities instead on Palestine. As a leading politician put it, "After the recent events in Damascus, we must change our plans entirely. Southern Syria is no more. We must defend Palestine." As all nationalist movements were doing, they needed a shared narrative around which to build their identity, and the Jewish and British imposition in Palestine was the natural and even obvious issue to focus on. And the story it told, you could say again naturally, was not a happy one. Arabs had tolerated a Jewish presence in Palestine for centuries, but it was a small presence, almost entirely in Jerusalem, and there for religious purposes. It was entirely different to expect Arabs to tolerate a rapidly growing Jewish presence, one that demanded, in that moment, something like equal political voice in Palestine, and one that wanted, perhaps someday, to take over Palestine entirely. It was more than Arabs, or perhaps any people, would be willing to bear. They believed it was unjust, and identified the Balfour Declaration as the tipping point, the imperial decision that imposed Zionism on them. The British mandate in Palestine began with visible tension. Jews, happy with how things were developing, found it was in their interest to generally cooperate with the British. Through immigration, greater prosperity, and a greater and greater presence in Palestine, they could gradually take over more and more of it, eventually, they thought, forming a majority, and somehow creating a state. As Weizmann put it in a Zionist meeting after the declaration was made, "We all agree on the final aim, and from now, it is simply a question of tactics as to how to achieve it. We need an evolutionary tactic. The declaration affords us the opportunity to become the masters of Palestine. As long as we do not have people and money, we cannot demand more than that. There is a British proverb about the camel in the tent. At first, the camel sticks in one leg, and eventually, it occupies the whole tent. This must be our policy." Arabs held essentially the opposite view. Every advance that Jews made, in their eyes, was a loss, something that further threatened their claim to their homeland. They believed that if they cooperated with the British, it would recognize the legitimacy of the mandate, which in turn would recognize legitimacy of the Jewish presence there. Arabs, therefore, took a stance of non-cooperation. They focused instead on spreading their message, on creating a unified, energized political body that could stand up to the challenge of Zionism. They had numbers on their side, but faced challenges. Perhaps most significantly, only a small minority were literate, making it difficult for Arabs to follow news outside of their local politics. For example, even a decade later, in the 1930s, a Palestinian teacher tried rallying locals in Transjordan in a protest against Balfour. As him and his students chanted "Down with Balfour," more joined and started, uncomprehendingly, chanting the name of a local shoemaker. But still, Arab nationalism spread, and as it spread, it brought a new dynamic to Palestine. There were now two concrete nations competing for power: a Palestinian nation made up of Arabs, and a Jewish nation. The Jewish nation had been organized for decades thanks to Zionism. The Palestinian nation, too, was becoming organized. As the 20s went on, both sides clarified and polarized, each side seeing itself in relation to and in contrast of the other. Social life in Palestine had previously been heavily mingled. If you look at photographs from before then, for example, it's often hard to tell who is Arab or Jewish or a Christian. But as identities crystallized into particularist nationalisms, and nationalisms framed each other as opponents, things changed. As a leading Zionist at the time put it, "What continually worries me is the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. Superficially it is improved in so much as there is no danger of pogroms, but the two people have become much more estranged in their thinking. Neither has any understanding of the other." In 1924, the Palestinian Arab Congress commented from their side, "It is a gross error to believe that Arab and Jew may come to an understanding, if only each of them exchanges his code of extremism for another of moderation. When the principles underlying two movements do clash, it is futile to expect their meeting halfway." Many Zionists still ignored the conflict, but when it was discussed, it was, in a historical irony, broadly referred to as the Arab question. Across the 1920s, Zionist progress seemed to stall. Developments in Palestine didn't seem to be bringing them closer to a Jewish state. Immigration increased significantly under the British, thanks to their more open policies, but also due to a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. European Jews were blamed for all sorts of things after the Bolshevik takeover in Russia, and were most damningly blamed for the Bolshevik Revolution itself. In the chaotic civil war that followed the Russian Revolution, Jews were brutally attacked from all sides. Something like 100,000 or 200,000 were killed. Many fled to Palestine, but immigration quotas kept Jews from building towards a majority. The Arab population growth was still higher. The lack of a sense of progress then gave Zionism its first major internal challenger. It was a group that took the Jewish claim towards Palestine and vocally drove it to an extreme. For context, Jews had been thought of for a long time, stereotypically, as a meek group of people. People who were submissive and physically weak. But it was something that Zionists were starting to depart from and even disdain. For example, Ahad Ha'am critiqued the behavior of Jews in a Russian pogrom by saying, "It is a disgrace for 5 million human souls to unload themselves on others, to stretch their necks to the slaughter and cry for help, without as much as attempting to defend their honor and lives." It was thought that there was a new type of Jew being fashioned in Palestine, what a prominent Zionist called muscular Judaism, tough and assertive. Zionism, in general, can be thought of as an expression of that, Jews becoming active and assertive, moving to Palestine and building up the land with hard labor. But some believed they weren't going far enough. They needed to be even tougher, more assertive. There was a key ingredient they believed Zionists were missing: violence. A man from Odessa named Vladimir Jabotinsky emerged as the leading figure of that belief. In 2 essays in 1923 and 1925, he, unlike other Zionists, dealt with the Arab question head-on and gave it a clear policy. First, like other Zionists, he believed that Jews around the world were suffering and needed somewhere to go. "It is said that we Jews number 15 million people scattered throughout the world," he said. "Half of them are now literally homeless, poor, hunted wretches. One could fault them for choosing Palestine as the Jewish home over somewhere else, like Uganda. But if we look more closely into the matter," he said, "we shall find that the same evil exists there too. At that point in time, all habitable land on earth was taken. Everywhere Jews went, they would be a colonizer, and all native populations would resist them, which meant that the problems they were having in Palestine now would be a problem anywhere. Every native population in the world," he said, "resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." So Arabs could not be expected to cooperate with Zionists. They could only be expected to resist. From there, Jabotinsky was willing to say something that other Zionists wouldn't say out loud. Zionism was moving forward anyway, without Arab consent, even against Arab consent. For Jabotinsky, that wasn't a problem. Considering Jews' situation, he believed it was the right thing to do. There is no other morality, he said. The logic to Jabotinsky then was simple. Since Zionism couldn't operate in Palestine through the politics of consent, all that was left were the politics of force. Zionism needed to operate, as he put it, behind an iron wall, something that would protect them from the native population while they expanded into it. He argued that as a sort of bonus, it was the only path that would ever bring moderation from Arabs. When a living people yields in matters of such a vital character, he said, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they can make no breach in the iron wall. Not till then will they drop their extremist leaders, whose watchword is never, and the leadership will pass to the moderate groups, who will approach us with a proposal that we should both agree to mutual concessions. In other words, the only way to reach an agreement in the future is to abandon all idea of seeking an agreement at present. This is considered a decidedly right-wing take on Zionism. It concerns itself with the particular interests of Jews and says it's willing to do just about anything to achieve them. In this case, by subjugating another population by force. It was that emphasis on violence that set Jabotinsky apart from other leaders of his time. Of all the necessities of national rebirth, he said, shooting is the most important of them. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. Jabotinsky was influenced by the rise of right-wing nationalisms in Europe that also emphasized violence as a means to their ends, especially Italy, where Italian fascism had just taken power under Mussolini. There had also been a trend towards militarism and right-wing thinking among Jews in Palestine for decades. Perhaps the first clear example was the Hashomer, Hebrew for the Watchman, a guard organization that predicted and even glorified an armed struggle over Palestine. Their slogan went, "In blood and fire, Judea fell. In blood and fire, Judea shall arise." As this new way of thinking emerged, Jabotinsky became established as the figure at the head of it, serving as something of a moderate within a range of militant voices. Their politics became known as revisionism, meaning they wanted to revise Zionist policies, typically in a more assertive, less compromising direction. Their stance towards what was then called Transjordan served as a prominent example. The British had originally meant to include Transjordan as part of Palestine in the mandate. But when Arabs lost Syria to the French, the British gave them Transjordan as an attempt at compensation. Revisionists, uncompromisingly, believed it was theirs. "There are two banks to the Jordan," went their slogan referencing the river. "One is ours, and so is the other." As revisionism became established, militant groups sprung up across Palestine, the biggest of which was the Haganah, Hebrew for defense. Two other notable groups were the Irgun, a solidly revisionist group in Palestine, and Betar, a youth group more heavily concentrated in Europe. Politically in Palestine, revisionists were still a minority, but for a minority, they were loud. There had been a slow escalation in violence in Palestine, all the way up until the British assumed the mandate in 1922. Then there was a quiet period, a period that was technically peaceful, but with rising tension. Land sales and immigration were the key issues driving it. And of the two, immigration proved to be the biggest source of tension. The British tried to open immigration enough to appease Jews, but limited enough to protect the Arab majority in Palestine. Both parties were left perpetually unsatisfied. Jews always wanted more immigration, and Arabs always wanted less. As the Jewish population grew and grew in Palestine, they became more and more assertive about their claim to it, which, in turn, made Arabs feel ever more threatened. As tensions rose and rose, attention became focused on the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. To Jews, an ancient retaining wall for their sacred Second Temple, and a wall to Muslims where Muhammad tied his horse before ascending to heaven. Muslims accused Jews of violating the status quo by installing a gender barrier during Yom Kippur. The Muslims of Palestine are determined to sacrifice body and soul in order to safeguard their religious rights, warned a newspaper. It is enough that their national rights have been stolen from them. The Mufti then encouraged a rumor. He warned of the unlimited greedy aspirations of the Jews, who were plotting to gradually take possession of the mosque on the Temple Mount. As tensions kept rising, Jews held a large demonstration at the wall that broke their permit, making political speeches, waving the Zionist flag, and singing their national anthem, the Hatikva. The year was 1929, and a tipping point was reached. Arab protests broke out and spread, developing into rioting and violence across Palestine. Revisionists were still a minority, and the Jewish response was dictated by moderates, who insisted on the usual policy of havlaga, self-restraint even when attacked. By the time the British regained order, more than 100 were killed on both sides, most of the Arabs by British police. In the aftermath of the violence, Britain launched an investigation and decided to further limit Jewish immigration and land purchases. Jews were becoming despondent. Weizmann acknowledged the lack of progress with his British policy and resigned as the head of the Jewish Agency. Revisionists had been present at the wall demonstrations and were blamed by the British for the uprising. Jabotinsky, while abroad, was banned from returning to Palestine. Weizmann was declining in health and influence. His major contribution to Zionism had already been made. Questions about his replacement and the future of Zionism were surfacing. There were two major contenders: Revisionism, led by Jabotinsky from abroad, and the politics of David Ben-Gurion, a man who built his political base by allying the socialist left of Zionism. As a socialist, Ben-Gurion was center-left, essentially wanting strong public services. Like the other Zionists of his time, though, nationalism was the pressing issue. Jews needed to come together as a nation and create a state. Everything else was secondary. As a nationalist, Ben-Gurion wasn't far from Chaim Weizmann's politics, perhaps a little farther right. He focused more on national segregation. A major issue for him was emphasizing Hebrew labor, which was a soft way of saying excluding Arabs from the Jewish economy. Without Hebrew labor, he said, there is no way to absorb the Jewish masses. Without Hebrew labor, there will be no Jewish economy. Without Hebrew labor, there will be no homeland. and anyone who does anything counter to the principle of Hebrew labor harms the most precious asset we have for fulfilling Zionism. Ben-Gurion's leftist coalition proved to be successful. By 1935, he was elected by the Zionist Congress to be the head of the Jewish Agency, making him effectively the next leader of Zionism. Meanwhile, in Europe, in 1933, Hitler came to power. It was unclear exactly where things were heading, but their anti-Semitic platform made many German Jews anxious to leave. Their leaving suited the Germans, so long as they gave up much of their wealth and belongings. The Jewish Agency penned a controversial agreement with Hitler's government, using Jewish German money to buy German goods and fund Jewish German immigration to Palestine. The increase in immigration led Palestinians to respond with riots. The outlook for Jews worsened and worsened in Europe. Jews, en masse, tried to flee. Immigration continued into Palestine at unprecedented rates for 3 years. As it continued, tensions rose and rose between Arabs and Jews until it reached a boiling point. In April 1936, Arabs stopped 2 cars on the road, killing 2 Jewish civilians. This time, militant Jews gave an aggressive response, killing 2 random Arabs in return. If they imagined that would put an end to the bloodshed, commented the Haganah in retrospect, they were soon to be disappointed. More killings followed with revenge killings that escalated into an Arab riot spreading across the country. A general strike was called. The British sent a prestigious commission, a royal commission, to try to find a solution to Palestine's problems. In 1937, they gave their report. An irrepressible conflict has arisen between 2 national communities within the narrow bounds of one small country. About 1 million Arabs are in strife, open or latent, with some 400,000 Jews. There is no common ground between them. Partition seems to offer at least some chance of ultimate peace. We can see none in any other plan. The plan would have ended the mandate and split Palestine into 2 states. Palestinians would have the much bigger state. Jews were offered around 20% of Palestine. Zionists debated it. For revisionists, it was ridiculous. The state being offered was far too small. Weizmann and Ben-Gurion were in favor of it. To them, borders could be expanded later. As Ben-Gurion put it, Herzl would have accepted as a godsend a charter for any part of Palestine and put his stake in the Jewish state, without any commitment that this, and only this, will always be the Jewish state. There were 2 words of huge consequence to Ben-Gurion, as he put it, in the plan: forced transfer. Arabs would be forced to emigrate out of Jewish lands. Arabs, as usual, rejected any compromise. An Arab Congress met in Syria and made a statement. Palestine was an integral part of the Arabian homeland. Britain had to choose between our friendship and the Jews. The Arab revolt continued. Arabs had made their first provisional government, the Arab Higher Committee, at the start of the revolt. Britain saw it as being behind the revolt and banned it, exiling many of its members. The Arab revolt intensified, now attacking not just Jewish targets, but the British as well. Towards the end of 1938, a British general officer summed up the situation by saying, "The rebel gangs have now acquired, by terrorist methods, such a hold over the mass of the population that it is not untrue to say that every Arab in the country is a potential enemy of the government." Germany, meanwhile, spread at surprising speed, taking Austria and the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, then followed that with its first pogrom, Kristallnacht. The lead up to World War II was beginning. Britain believed it needed order in Palestine. Through a massive show of force, the Arab revolt was crushed. About 1/10 of Arab males between 20 and 60 were killed, wounded, or exiled. In Britain's eyes, maintaining order was their foremost concern. Weizmann's politics had made it clear to them that they had Zionist support. Arab support they could still lose, so it was on that which they concentrated. Britain shifted its policy. In a white paper, they announced that an independent Jewish state was out of the question. They severely limited Jewish land sales and immigration, and pledged that in 5 years, all immigration would be subject to Arab consent. Zionists were outraged, increasingly seeing enemies in both the British and the fascist powers of Europe. Weizmann, closing the Zionist Congress that year, spoke to the impending dark time that Jews seemed to be faced with everywhere. If, as I hope, we are spared in life and our work continues, who knows, perhaps a new light will shine upon us from the thick, black gloom. Germany, meanwhile, took the rest of Czechoslovakia and began World War II with its invasion of Poland. For most of the war, Palestine was relatively quiet. Arabs and Jews essentially sat as spectators to bigger events happening across the world. For Arabs, the British White Paper didn't go far enough. During the war, they overwhelmingly sided with the Axis powers. The Mufti openly allied with Mussolini and Hitler, and did so fully understanding their intentions. Hitler had told him that Germany was resolved, step by step, to ask one European nation after another to solve its Jewish problem. As soon as German armies reached the southern exit of Caucasia, he said, Germany's objective would then solely be the destruction of the Jewish element residing in the Arab sphere. Arab public opinion, meanwhile, sat around 88% in favor of the German war effort, though for most Arabs, it was probably a matter of their simply being against Britain. A musician in Jerusalem recalled the mood there. They hated the British for their injustice, dishonesty, and the Balfour Declaration, and hoped Germany would win the war. They used to sit, listening to the news, waiting for headlines of German victory, grieving over good news for England. For Jews in general, the dynamic was reversed. As Germany spread and its anti-Semitic politics became more and more extreme, more Jews than ever wanted to flee Europe, but found immigration virtually everywhere had closed, Palestine included. Jews in Palestine found the situation intolerable. Many focused on illegal immigration, trying to get as many Jews out of Europe as possible. Jabotinsky, meanwhile, visiting a Betar camp in New York, died of a heart attack. Germany appeared unstoppable. As its armies entered Egypt, moving closer and closer to Palestine, Jews there had nowhere to go. They prepared for the worst. There was talk among Jews of mass suicide, while the Haganah drew up plans for a last stand in Haifa. Tens of thousands volunteered to help the British fight in Africa. The Jews of Palestine were of course spared from disaster. Germany never made it there. It was in Europe where Germany found, you could say, the most success, spreading itself through 1941 and 1942 across the length and breadth of it, taking France, most of Scandinavia and the Balkans, and crucially for Jews, virtually all of Eastern Europe. The Jews on the continent of Europe were trapped. When news of the Holocaust emerged then, it shocked the world. No one was prepared for what happened. It was, in a sense, the ultimate vindication of Zionism. It was harder than ever to argue that Jews could be kept safe if their fate was left to other nations. But even the most pessimistic Zionists hadn't predicted the magnitude, the extremity of what happened. Anti-Semitism before then had been so widespread that it was normal, even mundane. Now, much of the world experienced something like closure to the Jewish question, at least closure in the realm of public debate. Jews suddenly experienced unprecedented levels of sympathy and approval. The Axis powers, of course, lost the war, but the temperature of politics in Palestine was rising. Arabs believed they couldn't concede victimhood status to Jews. To do so would risk their home. A shakeup of power had just occurred, and statehood in Palestine was becoming an open question. There were many displaced Jews to consider, and many of them did not want to go back to Europe. Jews in Palestine were inflamed. They wanted to be free from the British, and they wanted their own state for themselves and for the refugees of the world to emigrate. They were tired of waiting. They wanted it now. During the Second World War, revisionists had already been attacking the British. Now moderates, with the Haganah, joined with them. In 1946, they essentially started a terror campaign, carrying out a series of attacks on the British, including damaging the railway network and destroying the prestigious King David Hotel in Jerusalem, something the Haganah helped plan but didn't participate in. Britain was exhausted from Palestine and exhausted from the war. It felt it was losing control. It decided then to surrender the question of Palestine to the newly created United Nations. The United Nations created a commission to study the issue, intentionally led by disinterested states. After 3 months, it presented its preferred plan, what it considered the best course of action for Palestine to take: to partition Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem kept under international control. This time, Jews would get a little more than half of Palestine, thought to make room for European refugees. It was space mostly created by including the Negev desert. The issue, then, was put to a vote. The conflict had, in a span of 50 years, gone from being a subtle one, infiltration as Herzl had called it, to being in the spotlight of world affairs. A yes vote from the UN would mean that Jews and Arabs would both have international sanction to build their own states. The vote had 2 major supporters: the Soviet Union, which was historically anti-Zionist, but thought the vote would give them leverage over the British in the Middle East. The other major supporter was the United States. When the United States entered the Second World War, Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, and the majority of the Zionist lobby recognized it was about to emerge on the world stage as the next dominant power. They shifted their lobbying efforts into the US in 1941. Between their efforts and the pressure from the public, which by then had become radically more in favor of Zionism, American politicians felt unprecedented levels of pressure. President Truman later recalled that it was the most pressure and propaganda he had experienced during his presidency. The United States voted yes and lobbied for other powers to do the same. Despite their support, the vote needed a 2/3 majority, and even with the widespread sympathy Jews were experiencing as an effect of the Holocaust, it was widely expected to fail. Uruguay filibustered, buying time for the Zionist lobby to convince more states. The delay worked. When the vote was held, the resolution to partition Palestine narrowly passed. 33 countries for, 13 against, with 10 abstentions, Britain being one.
Abstain.
Arab and Muslim states had been the opposition and were outraged. A Syrian delegate acted as a spokesman. Lobbying had forced a result on Palestine that the majority living there did not want. It was the greatest political scandal of the century, he said. Ben-Gurion shouted from the balcony of the Jewish Agency, "We are a free people." Palestinians could have used the opportunity to build their own state, but to do so would recognize legitimacy of the UN vote and the Jewish state it endorsed. They had for decades been maximalist and absolutist. They would accept nothing but sovereignty over all of Palestine. As the Mufti put it, the vote was null and void. Arabs rioted in Jerusalem, and back-and-forth violence quickly escalated. The British mostly remained neutral, while Palestine entered a state of civil war. Arabs, though, were more or less in a state of anarchy. They had little in the way of governing institutions, or an authority that could hold them together. The middle and upper classes widely fled from the chaos and violence into neighboring Arab countries. Arabs fought guerrilla warfare against the far better organized and far better equipped Haganah. After months of fighting, it became clear that without help, they would be crushed. A newly created League of Arab States decided to intervene. With the combined might of Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, they would attack from all sides as soon as the British withdrew, saving Palestinians and demonstrating to the world their Arab unity. Seeing the Arab armies building on the border, Jews faltered. In Tel Aviv, 10 leaders gathered in a room. A vote was held. Should they create a state now and almost certainly provoke an Arab attack, or wait for a safer opportunity? The vote to create a state narrowly passed, 6-4, 4 against. As Ben-Gurion argued, the opportunity to create a state may not come again. It was, perhaps, now or never. On May 14, 1948, Britain withdrew. As it happened, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Arabs surrounding Israel gave the order to attack. To be continued.